Okay.
Dear Warren, I'm very happy that you found time to participate in this conversation. Of course, this is the initial conversation. I'm planning to discuss Mamluk policies and Mamluk fiscal policies in coming weeks and coming months, of course, when you're free and when we arrange timing which is suitable for both you and me. First of all, what was the period of Mamluk Empire that you studied the most? We discussed about the financial crisis in late 14th century, early 15th century, and how the expansion of Tamerlane affected the fiscal policy of Mamluk Empire, because some of these things were correlated.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. I'm happy to be here. It's good to see you again. When I started in this field of researching Mamluk money and Mamluk economic history, I had a very narrow sense of the Mamluk Sultanate. I view them, sort of in that traditional periodization of 1250 to 1517. That's, of course, several decades ago now.
Exactly.
Sorry to say.
Yeah.
And of course, there's this traditional periodization scheme within Mamluk history of, itself of 1250 to 1382, and when most of the sultans were from the Kipchak steppe in origin, and then from 1382 to 1517, when they were from many of them were from Circassia, and the sources call them, Dalat Turk or Dalat Drakis, for example.
Yeah.
What I've found in my own research here is that those time periods are useful for a lot of things, but they're not very useful for Mamluk economic history. And I base that primarily upon developments in coinage. So setting that aside, I think you asked specifically about Tamerlane and his invasion in 1405, his occupation of Damascus. And without a doubt, this was a serious disruption in the history of the Mamluk Sultanate. It was an expensive war. It was a costly war. It was a defeat. And then they had to deal with the repercussions of Tamerlane moving. But I think other than the fact that, Tamerlane was such a remarkable figure in his brutality and excesses, and he's easy to focus on, I don't really see that event as having any major impact on existing economic practices and policies. They exacerbated the situation in which the Mamluk Sultanate found itself in, but I don't think they really changed anything.
What were the major factors for the change of the Mamluk fiscal policy?
Well, I think Mamluk fiscal policy, I tend to find it useful to view it as sort of in two prongs. One, their central policy, such as it was, I think could be labeled as reactionary, in the sense that they reacted to events around them, and that is in part because the main goal of the Sultanate's approach to money economy, the royal fisc, was extractive. How do we get the tax revenue into our hands so we can pay the soldiers, accumulate the wealth necessary to build the large complexes that so many of the Mamluk sultans built, not just in Cairo, but in Jerusalem and in many of the cities of Syria, not to mention fortresses across Jordan, etc. And so, there was always this need for money, for wealth, to distribute as they saw fit. So, in my work with working specifically on Mamluk money, because I think the coinage is an centralized resource for these discussions. People have tended to look at it and then a coin here, a coin there, or in some cases, I mean, there's been some great scholarship, don't get me wrong, but it hasn't really been fully, I think, integrated for the most part in discussions of the Mamluk economy, Mamluk economic history. So what are the periods of Mamluk money then? I would say that that you look at the first few decades, 2, 3, 4 decades of the Mamluk Sultanate after they, from their origins in the Battle of Mansoura in 1249, 1250, their policy is their monetary policy is basically a continuation of Ayyubid monetary policy. Monies and all coinages in all three metals, gold, silver, and copper, with different uses, obviously different markets in which those monies would be used. By Bars's reign and after, there's some stylistic changes in the coinage, but it's essentially still working on the same pattern that they inherited from the Mamluks. I think the really big change comes into place precisely in the period that you mentioned earlier, in the early 15th century, but a few years after Timur's invasion. And this is when, in regards to gold and silver coinages, there is a radical reshaping of Mamluk coinage in those two metals. Essentially, there's a transition from silver dirhams and gold dinars that were in effect ingots, small ingots of metal that circulated by weight, to coinages that were much more regularly produced, or should I say, minted with a greater attention to detail to both fineness and weight. And that coinage survives from the basically from the reign of the Caliph al-Musta'in Billah in the Muayyad Sheikh and Baibars, and afterwards in the silver. And while there had been attempts to change the gold coinage under al-Muayyad Sheikh, it's really the change that sticks is implemented during the reign of al-Ashraf Barzbai. So the reasons why these changes took place are not clear. Some have argued it's a response to developments in European coinage, and there's certainly an element to that. The Venetian ducat, in particular, had begun to spread had been circulate widely throughout the Mamluk domains in Egypt and Syria. Was it a response to that or not? I'm fairly agnostic on that question. I see the influx of foreign coinages as a factor, but certainly not a new factor, because the monetary marketplace of the medieval Mediterranean world, in which the Mamluk Sultanate and all of its provinces was part of, was quite complex, with many types of coins in circulation, many of them decades, if not centuries, after their date of issue. So, basically what I'm saying here is that we need to look at Mamluk economic history outside of that prism of the traditional Bahri Burji period that we are so used to. And I think and other people have drawn attention to the reign of al-Ashraf Barzbai in particular because of his attempts to nationalize, if you will, to a government takeover of the spice trade. And I think that we have this situation where the demands on the Sultanate, and particularly its military forces, keeping its army controllable and possible of going into the field, that there was a constant demand for more money, and this was a response by Barzbai and his administration to raise more money.
How the sugar production affected the economics of the Mamluk Empire in one of the previous podcasts, I've spoken to Konstantinos Politis, our mutual friend, who spent time studying sugar monopoly in Gorsafi and in the Jordan Valley. Was that also one of the causes of the downfall of Mamluk Empire in 15th century?
I think there's two issues at work here. I mean, without a doubt, the 15th century, from our perspective in the future, looking back and seeing what's happened, there is the Mamluk sultanate is overrun in 1516, 1517 by the Ottomans, and there are several reasons for that. One of which was that the Mamluks were no longer as strong, if you will, as they once were. But as to build on what Constantine has said, but also to look at what our mutual colleague and friend Bethany Walker has detailed, using the work of other scholars as well, Jordanian and American both, about what's going on in the Hur, what's going on in the Jordan Valley for sugar production. And if I'm reading her evidence and conclusions correctly, you actually see governmental investment, or maybe perhaps governmental is not the right word, but sultanic investment in those regions. And we see, irrigation schemes, windmills, sugar mills coming into place that clearly, and the archaeological evidence I hear is quite clear, I believe, led to an increased production of sugar in that region, which presumably was not all locally consumed and would have been, then sent out further afield for trade. But that's an industry that requires constant investment. Just as in Egypt, there's that need to constantly keep up the incredibly complex irrigation system of the Nile Valley. And from many, many sources, the general picture that we have of the history of the Mamluk Sultanate is that post-Black Death, in the short run and in the longer run, that the level of investment necessary to keep those systems productive declined, and in some cases disappeared. And so, even so, it's a very long way from 1348 to 1517. That's why I think, looking at the reign of Baibars as so many, of Barzbai, as so many scholars have done, see, what he was doing in the early 15th century to increase funds.
How the bubonic plague, so-called the Black Death, affected the Mamluk economic power in 14th century, mid 14th century?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thanks to the path-breaking work of Michael Doles some 40 years ago, we know, and the work of others since then, we know a bit, quite a bit, I would say, about the impact of the bubonic plague and all of its forms on the regions of the Mamluk Sultanate. And quite simply, it was devastating. There's a wonderful eyewitness account, about a 5 or 6 page epistle, a risala, if you will, written by a Syrian scholar named Ibn al-Wardi, about how the plague swept across Eurasia and then hit Syria and Egypt. And it's a wonderful Arabic piece with using all kinds of, I'll use the phrase wordplay, but there's no play involved. Punning on the meanings of Arabic place names and whatnot, talking about how the plague came into Ghusul and washed it clean of people, that sort of thing. And so we have the immediate first round in the 1347, 1348 period, which killed well, historical demography is different, it's difficult, but killed, probably along the same lines of what we know in Central Asia and Western Europe in particular, a third to a half of the population. Again, some places could miss it, some places were completely devastated. But what really, I think, and Dole sketches this out very well, what really made the issue difficult for the Mamluk Sultanate was you could survive the plague. And it wasn't
with the less percentage than COVID-19.
yeah, and you could have an immunity if you will, but that means you had to have survived it. And of course, the Mamluk Sultanate, the core of the army was built upon imported slaves from Central Asia, and what we know is that every 20 or 30 years or so, roughly, there was a recurring wave of the bubonic plague throughout the Mamluk domains. And the people that were hit the hardest were either newborns, but primarily immigrants, such as any slave, any young man that had been imported into the Mamluk system in the decade or 2 or 3 since the previous outbreak, which then meant, these were expensive purchases and cost a lot of money. And then to train them that if, someone whom you invested so much in died, you had to replace them and start the process all over again. So I think that additional expense, which we can't quantify, unfortunately, must have been pretty significant, and a drain on the Sultan's treasury.
How Sultan Umayyad Sheikh imposed his reforms? What were reforms of Sultan Umayyad Sheikh? We discussed that in the recently published article, and here we can discuss it in a more detailed way and manner.
The first part of your question, how did sultans enforce a new coinage, is for me a particularly intriguing and challenging question, because and this goes back to my statement of the Mamluk fiscal policies, if you will, being primarily reactive. There was no central bank, no central institution controlling the overall economy of the Mamluk Sultanate, and nor were there barriers in place to control the monetary supply in circulation in the Mamluk Sultanate. So on the other hand, you read in the copious documentary sources, think of all the histories written in the Mamluk period by Mamluk era historians, and you'll read references to the markets shutting down in response to some sort of economic policy or a shortage of something or in protest. You'll also read about instances of counterfeiting causing disruption. And it is true that a sultanate, a government can support its coinage by insisting that all payments to it be made in its coinage. But the degree to which the Mamluk Sultanate was able to do any of that, I think, is not clear. And I think you can't assume that the Mamluk Sultanate had the ability to, for example, forbid the use of a foreign coin within its vast dominions. And this means that some of it would have been market-driven, some of it would have been acceptance of the populace. And of course, we also know from these same Mamluk sources that the authors of these Mamluk sources were primarily from the ulama, not exclusively, but primarily. And their concerns were other. They tend to be more urban focused, and they tend to be more focused on the aspects of the higher levels of society. There are exceptions, and we do get glimpses of what everyday folk, if you will, thought about certain things. So in my sense, so what I tend to look at is, okay, so of all these various attempts to change coins, which ones seem to stick? And there is a rough, but not necessarily reliable, perhaps, correlation between numbers which survive and whether they're great or small. I don't push that too far, because the absence of evidence doesn't mean the absence of doesn't mean absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. And especially when you're dealing with gold and silver coins, there's always the chance that they can be melted down and turned into other things. But actually, that actually holds true for copper as well. So El Muayyad Sheikh comes into power in 1412. He and his colleague, rival, the Emir Nawruz al-Hafizi, had succeeded in removing Nasr Faraj ibn Barkuk from the throne. And then they start to quarrel, as Mamluk rivalries between emirs often resulted. And they placed the Abbasid Caliph al-Musta'in Billah on the throne for about 6 months. And during that period, Nawruz al-Hafizi seems to have been the figure behind the issuing of these new types of silver coins that were, and they were new in the fact that that for the previous 150 plus years of the Mamluk Sultanate, Mamluk silver coins had been, as I mentioned, ingots in effect. You couldn't say one coin was always one dirham. You know, the denomination and the coin didn't match up precisely like it does in modern money. You know, 1 cent is 1 cent, whether it's 1 dinar is 1 dinar, unless the dollar bill, the dollar bill is torn up, in which case it's nothing, right? But these coins from the reign of El Musta'in don't survive in very large numbers at all. But what happens, and here finally I've gotten to El Muayyad Sheikh, during El Muayyad Sheikh's reign, that style, smaller, thinner, purer, more consistently minted to a weight standard, becomes the coin of becomes the only silver that's minted. Weight standard. It was certainly more precise than what came before it, which, I mean, I've literally seen and weighed thousands of Mamluk silver coins, and they can be less than a gram. They can 7 gram. They can be at every single decimal point in between. And we just don't see that with the coins of El Muayyad Sheikh, which survive in relatively good numbers, but then you see what happens in Barzbai's reign, and after that type of coins continues to the end of the Mamluk Sultanate, and many would say continues into the Ottoman period as well. With the Ottoman coins obviously have Ottoman names on them, but these small silver coins are very similar to what had been in circulation in those regions prior to the conquest.
Did you study financial policies of previous Islamic empires, like Fatimid? Yeah,
that's a great question.
Can you compare Fatimids, Ayyubids, and Mamluk in terms of fiscal policies and economies? Because economy is always a driving force of science, of warfare, of all kinds of ventures. If we don't have a successful economy, we cannot plan any of these things. So I think that economy was very important, not to say crucial, but probably crucial regarding these states.
Yeah. Now, and of course, the responsibilities of government are legion. They're not just defense, but they're insurance, justice, public welfare, things like this, all of which take money. And if we look at the region of Egypt and Syria in the long duration, we know that there are things that are unpredictable. What's the level of the Nile flood going to be? What level of rainfall is going to fall in the Ghouta around Damascus? Will there be a plague of insects, et cetera, et cetera? Those things are, of course, unpredictable and must be responded to. Is there a shortage of wheat causing bread riots in the street? And so that's, of course, the wider context. And then looking in at these specific ruling states, be it the Fatimids, the Ayyubids, the Seljuks, et cetera, in all their many different forms, and the smaller states around them. One of the issues that I deal with as a historian of Islamic history and as an educator of undergraduates on the history of the Muslim world, et cetera, is that so many people come in with an expectation that the Islamic world is monolithic. And of course, everyone knows this is not the case, that it matters while there are shared responsibilities, shared beliefs, shared orthodoxies and orthopraxies throughout the Islamic community, it's not everywhere and always the same, right? I extend that truism to looking at the situations of these empires that you mentioned, Fatimids, Ayyubids, Mamluks, etc., that each of them has to be looked at, not just by itself, but in how it fits with what came before and after. And one must be, intimately aware of the conditions in which those states were operating, and the fact that the Fatimids in Egypt, 969 to 1171, the Ayyubids, 1171 to 1250, 1260 into the 1260s in their Syrian holdings and beyond. And then the Mamluk Sultanate for 267 years, their internal situations change. The Mamluk Sultanate of 1320 is not the Mamluk Sultanate of 1420. These are pretty obvious and pretty straightforward if you think about it. So when I started researching Mamluk money, as an early dissertator and young scholar, I was very much focused on the Mamluk period because it gave me, it was a definable period that I could work with. And that was useful at the time. But what I've, of course, discovered in the subsequent decades is that that was too narrowly blinded. And that by necessity and willingly, I've had to learn more about the Ayyubid monetary policy in particular, but also start looking at Fatimid policy. And perhaps I can give you a summary by means of a story. The Fatimids in Egypt minted gold coins for which they are famous. Across their empire and into, when they were in Sicily and North Africa, they minted large numbers of gold coins weighing a mithqal. And a mithqal here is probably about somewhere between 4.2 and 4.3 grams, because that's another situation. Sometimes people assume that the mithqal is always 4.25 grams, the dirham is always 2.97 grams, and that is not supported by the surviving material culture of those times. We know that the weight values associated with those standards differed. I think that's been proven just by the, for example, the surviving weights that we have. But they minted a heck of a lot of gold, dinars and quarter dinars, very little silver. And what silver they did mint was, especially in Egypt and Syria, was extremely low quality, maybe a third silver or something like that. And then there are very few Fatimid copper coins surviving. And now that itself doesn't mean anything, because the Fatimid copper coins I've seen are extremely small and not very interesting in terms of aesthetics. And why is that important? Because what drove economic history of the medieval Islamic period or the early Islamic period for so long was private collections of coins. Private collections that were sometimes donated then to museums or institutional holdings like the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris or the British Museum in London, et cetera, et cetera. And collectors collect what they're interested in, and many of them, the interests of collectors are as varied as collectors themselves. But a lot of, Fatimid silver and Fatimid copper aren't as well. Aesthetics change over time too, but you look at them and you look at Fatimid gold, and Fatimid gold is not only more valuable, but there's some exceedingly interesting designs that they use on their coins. So the upshot of that is that we know a lot more about Fatimid gold than we know about silver or copper, and so their monetary marketplace was dominated by gold. And gold, of course, is high value. How do you use smaller and smaller transactions? Well, we also know that gold coins from the Fatimid period were cut up sometimes into very, very tiny little slivers of gold, which would still be probably worth more than a big silver dirham. But anyway, and their coinage was long assumed to be incredibly regular, a full mithqal and a quarter of mithqal. Towards the end of their reign, that the coins get a little bit lighter, but that's a whole nother story. The Ayyubids, on the other hand, in the reign of Saladin, for example, and onward, begin to continue to mint gold, but also increasingly mint silver. And they mint both low quality silver and then high quality silver, like 90+%. And then by the end of the reign, in Egypt primarily and in Syria, the silver is about 2/3 pure. And that system of gold coins, silver coins of about 2/3 purity, and from about 1220 on in Egypt, the issuance of copper coins once again was the system that the Mamluks inherited. And I think in order to really fully comprehend what the Mamluks were doing in the 1250s, 1260s, and throughout their sultanate, you have to understand that be aware of the developments in Ayyubid coinage and Fatimid coins before that, because it's all part of a stream. As much as I think it's important to take each time period there on its own, in its own time. They didn't emerge from nothing, right? And there is just like there's the consistency of Islamic law about coinage through this whole period. It's that balancing of those continuities within the specific differences of the eras of those ruling empires that is the sort of the high wire that you have to walk and negotiate.
How you found the last season of digging in Tel Hisban? I've seen you being very active when I came to inspect the site, and did you benefit in your studies by participating last October, and how you combine your studies on numismatics with the digging season? Because
Wow.
the team didn't gather for more than 3 years. The last time I came there was 2018. I came with Jack Green. Also, Andrea Zerbini, late Andrea Zerbini was there. And since 2018, we didn't have the opportunity to gather at Tel Hisban and witness a digging season.
Yeah, the immediate answer to your question is I have benefited a great deal, and my career has benefited a great deal, and my research has benefited a great deal from being associated with Tel Hisban. And in fact, coming into contact and beginning to work with archaeologists in the last 20 years has, I think, really really shaped my interests and my research. So that's without a doubt. I mean, I want to get that the opportunity to work with the team that that Bethany Walker has assembled from the University of Bonn, and her students who have gone on elsewhere, has been fabulous, has been truly remarkable from my perspective. But getting there in 2021, I've actually participated in the excavations in 2014, 2018, and 2021. And it was great to get back. It was great to reestablish contact with the team of scholars working there, and also meeting the new ones. And of course, I was recruited to first to start looking at material that had already been found in previous excavations. And then I've since been working on the material that has been found in these 2014, 2016, 18, and 21. In 21, unfortunately, there weren't a lot of coins found. A lot of them, the few that were found, most of them were copper-based coins from the pre-Islamic period, heavily corroded, and in some cases non-identifiable. Perhaps some general attribution possible from their size, like this is probably Roman, this is probably Byzantine, that sort of thing. Those coinages are complex in their own right. But they did find a couple middle Islamic period coins. They found them, one before I got there and one after I got there, and one after I left, actually. So I wasn't actually there at their moments of discovery, but the one that they found afterwards was really interesting. It was an Ayyubid coin from Aleppo or Hama, can't recall offhand, from the North Church excavations. And that, that places a 13th century date on that place. And as Bethany pointed out in her recent podcast with you, this late Ayyubid period seems to be the period of resettling and the beginning of the reemergence of Hispan as a significant community in the region. So that's, I think, really important. And then above and beyond that, the opportunity to work with archaeologists and work with their results means that we're finally approaching the point where we can begin to move the study of Mamluk money or Ayyubid money or anything away from institutional collections, which have no provenance, right? This was true well before 1970, and in some cases after. That we have the evidence, which is useful, and I'm glad we have that evidence because it enables us to establish basic typologies and read coins, etc. But now we can start to look at issues of circulation and perhaps learn more about local economies because we have coins from actual stratigraphies, right? And that is, I think, it's something that's been going on in other areas of numismatics for a long time. Greek and Roman numismatics and scholars have been working with archaeologically derived material for a very long time. And it's still, I would say, pretty much in its infancy for those of us who do Islamic history. But the benefits, I think, will be well worth the effort because we, in this case, will know the context from which the coin, in which the coin was found.
Do you think that the Mamluk state had a successful response to political, military, and economic crisis of 14th and early 15th century?
That's a really challenging question.
Exactly.
Exactly, yeah. I think one cannot discount the observation that the Mamluk Sultanate survived for 260 plus years,
Yeah.
and it weathered a great deal of bad situations, to put it bluntly. Those could ranging from things well beyond their control, such as disease, but also the constant military battles in which they were drawn into. I mean, we're lucky that the field of Mamluk studies has really exploded in the last 30, 40 years. People were aware of the Mamluks. People were studying the Mamluks across, within the region itself, in Europe and the United States. But really, in the last 40 years or so, we've seen the creation of think tanks, intellectual endeavors brought together for periods of years. There's an annual conference for Mamluk studies, things like that. So a lot more people are working on it, and we're learning more and more. Which is the way it should be. As more evidence comes to light and as more people start looking at things and start asking different questions, our view of the Mamluk Sultanate is growing and expanding and changing. And I think this focus, this more intense focus, sometimes leading into micro studies, has enabled us to understand that 267-year period of the Sultanate in much greater detail and with much greater nuance. And I don't think it's possible any longer to just dismiss the Mamluks as rapacious Turkish warriors, always killing each other. I'm really extending the stereotype here, but to see
this is very, it's oversimplified interpretation of Mamluk Empire. Otherwise, they wouldn't last 260 years.
And one must always be aware of how people want to present themselves. But the first 70 years of the Mamluk Sultanate, we know it. They didn't. They were engaged in what they saw as the defense of the Islamic world, right? Or at least their corner of the Islamic world.
Yeah.
The threat of the diminishing but still present threat of the Crusaders. The last Crusader fortress didn't surrender on the coast of Greater Syria, didn't surrender until 1302, Arwad. But that was clearly a goal of the early sultans, Baybars, Kalaun in particular, to eliminate the Crusader presence. And then, of course, at the same time they faced the Mongol. I think it's required to say the Mongol onslaught from the east, from the 1260s on as well. And I think you see that especially in Jordan. I'm wandering a little off track here, but we know, at least the Mamluk chronicles tell us, that after the expulsion of the last Crusaders, the Mamluks purposely destroyed or tore down parts of the coastal fortresses on the Mediterranean coast, so as to prevent, if another Crusader landing was to take place, that they wouldn't have a base that they could use as a resource. They wouldn't be able to establish a beachhead, to use a modern term. Whereas in Jordan, on the eastern frontier zone of the Mamluk state, after the Ayyubids certainly did this. After they took the fortresses in the Jordan Valley and then in the Kerak Plateau. We always think primarily of Shalbek and Karak. They reinforced them, and when the Mamluks took them over, they reinforced them again, in part, undoubtedly, because of that eastern border threat of the Mongols. And so, I think that in itself, just looking from perspective 600 years later, 800 years later, was a pretty significant set of achievements. And then when you see the set of challenges that the Black Death brought and presented to them, you see the attempts by various sultans to how to deal with these situations, how to deal with the complex politics inside the Mamluk community, etc. They certainly were not passive.
Of course.
They certainly were aware of these challenges,
Yeah.
and they took steps that they saw as fitting and appropriate at the time.
What was the financial, or let's say fiscal transformation or fiscal transition between Mamluk state and Ottoman Empire? How that shift took place, and maybe it's another trick question.
Yeah, I think we could talk about that a lot, but I was in a conference in Trieste about 14 years ago that was specifically on this topic of monetary changes in times of political transition. And my mentor in Islamic numismatics, an individual named Michael Bates, impressed upon me very early on that the political dates that you encounter in handbooks of dynasties and things like that often have, which are true and real. You know, we can tell when one ruler, you know, took the place of another ruler, often have very little relation to events on the ground. And of course, my work with archaeology has shown this as well. I mean, as Bethany and others working in this middle period Islamic Jordan said, you know, there's no bell ringing in Hispan saying we're now moving from the Ayyubid to the Mamluk period, you know, to be a little facetious there. But in the case of the Ottoman conquest of Syria and Egypt, we see initially a continuation of the same types of coins for the most part. Gold coins of about 3 grams, 3.5 grams, silver coins less than 2 grams. The designs and the names change, right? I mean, an Ottoman Tura on a gold coin is far different from a Mamluk inscription talking about Kansu al-Ghauri. But they're basically the same types of coins. And we saw the situation when the Mamluks gradually replaced the Ayyubids across Egypt and Syria. The bigger changes came later. And I think that's something that's especially useful for historians who don't work with material culture to be aware of. Many, of course, are. But just like Mamluk coinage isn't, just like Islamic coinage from the 7th and 8th century on to the onset of machine-struck coinage varied tremendously. We should be aware of those differences and not assume that it was everywhere and every time, every place the same.
Thank you so much for your time. If you want to add something, please. We're going to continue discussing fiscal policies and Islamic numismatics. Of course, maybe next talk will be about Islamic numismatics and your experiences with institutions in Jordan, and what kind of feedback you received from places like the Museum of Numismatics, Museum of Coins, which is part of Al-Ahli Bank. They have a very good museum, and the late Chairman Schultz was the one who was very involved with numismatics. I met him at Acre 7 years ago. Unfortunately, he passed away, and he wasn't in a very good shape recently, so I couldn't contact him.
I would be very happy to talk about that and these other issues that you mentioned. I have extremely fond memories of the time I spent in the Numismatic Museum there in Shmeisani with Dr. Gussus and his staff. It's that I'm willing to do that and willing to pursue the conversation. I think one issue that we might want to discuss, if you find it of interest, is this whole issue of assumptions about how money works.
Yeah, that's a very good, very good topic, especially for me, who never collected enough money for myself, but I like the money talk. And I like people like Floyd Mayweather, who collects only cash. If you watch that,
Yeah.
if you're a fan of boxing, he doesn't pay by credit card. He only carries bags with cash, like in old
Well,
days.
that's one way. I suppose he might have bags of silver coinage and gold coinage
Maybe.
under his mattress as well.
That's funny. This guy is hilarious.
Yeah.
No, definitely.
My wife once.
Yes, please.
My wife once kidded me that, by the time I got interested in money, it was old money that was no longer worth anything.
Yeah, exactly. You miss 80 or 200 years instead of collecting more recent stuff.
Yeah.
But no, this is important topic. We'll continue, and I'm looking forward to discussing not only the numismatic museum, but other subjects that we mentioned. Hopefully, you're going to be back to Jordan in 2022 or 2023. I don't know what are your plans, but it would be nice to see you in person, and we'll continue talking.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this and look forward to talking to you again. I hope I'm able to visit Jordan again in the not too distant future.
And we'll continue to preparing articles about your research for the JT.
Okay, thank you.
But this platform for me is much better because I don't have to cut valuable information. I don't have to think about the space formats and the local context, which specifically goes on my nerves. Because when someone comes and tells me, no, it's not related to Jordan, it's about Cairo and Damascus, I don't have the right answer to that person or editor.
Well, this is one of the curious elements and one of the most intriguing elements I think about with Islam, with Mamluk money in particular, is the fact that there were no mints in southern Balad Hashem.
Yeah,
there were no Mamluk mints in Jerusalem, other cities whatsoever. There were 5 or 6 regular Mamluk mints, but they were in Egypt or in Syria. And the fact that you find Mamluk coins from all of those mints in archaeological digs in Jordan, that indicates that there's a level of monetization in the local and rural economies.
True. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll keep in touch.
You're welcome. Thank you. Good to see you.
All the best.
To you as well.